Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. I hope that it's a really interesting 90-minute tour of the European health data space, and that you enjoy the all the amazing content that we've pulled together for you. At least what UPD is all about and what we do. We are an independent initiative. We are hosted at the NHS Confederation, now the NHS Alliance. If you hadn't sort of realised that we've now merged with NHS providers. We're funded by a range of organisations, including the Wellcome Trust, and we are driven by the mission of making the use of patient data more visible, trustworthy, understandable, with the ultimate goal that it can be used well, responsibly, and obviously in the public benefit. If we move on to the next slide, we do this in a variety of ways. We produce tools and resources. We undertake public research and bring together all that's known about public attitudes and expectations towards use of data to inform and shape policy and practices. We bring together other organisations across the health data community, and we support better communication about patient data too. Moving on to the next slide. If you're wondering sort of how UPD, I guess, got involved in the European health data space, building on, I guess, my predecessors' 2023 report into public attitudes to the European health data space, which was a consultation that was undertaken in 2022 with citizens in the UK and France and Belgium. We've been kind of exploring how we can support ongoing engagement now that the UK is not actually in the EU any longer. We are going to be running a programme of engagement events, including these two unpacked webinars, which obviously you're attending the first one of, as well as sort of other events such as like a hackathon with other non-EU third countries who we might want to share insights with and build alliances with too. And we'll be supporting UK experts to engage in some of the consultation events that are being run by TEDAS, to the organiser of thinking around this space as well. And we're producing a whole range of practical outputs too, hopefully, that you will find useful, from explainers, summary reports and case studies, as well as some parliamentary activity to make sure that ministers are engaged in this agenda. So before we get into the meat of the agenda, can we do a quick poll to see where we think you might be currently in terms of your understanding of European health data space and what relevance you think it holds? So again, I can't quite see anything but myself, so I don't know, is that poll up?
Yeah, that poll is up at the moment, so people can just scan the QR code and then pop in your answer. How much do you feel you know about the European health data space right now? Thank you.
Excellent. So we are at mostly in the sort of a little and not a lot stage, which is fantastic news for us. Make sure our content's interesting. Do you think ballot's still moving? I'll just give it another 10 seconds. Right, so should we move on to the second question? Oh, going down. No, go up. Brilliant. Thank you. I think that's about stopped moving. Still going a little bit. Give it another few seconds and then we'll call it there. It's really interesting to see where we started, and we hope obviously that those two polls move on a little bit in at the end. Brilliant. So as I mentioned, we've got a whole sort of range of content today, and we are incredibly grateful to the sort of star cast list that are joining us to run you through the European health data space. We are really hoping that you take away a much stronger understanding of what it's all about, and how some of the sort of challenges that have led to the shaping of the European health data space, but also insights into how the UK could really benefit from alignment with it, and the considerations that we all need to take into account as we try to do so. So without further ado, to kick us off, I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Andrew Morris, Director of HDR UK, and Tim Hubbard, with support from Anne, who is the Director of International Partnerships, who will be giving our keynote today.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to see everyone, and thanks for avoiding the sunshine to come and listen to this seminar. And can I thank Anna and Lucy for putting this on, because over the next few minutes, Tim, Anne, and I are going to try to convince you of one or two things. Firstly, the European health data space is important globally, in our quest to democratize access to excellent health services and research ecosystems for 8 billion people. EHDS is a major international pillar. Secondly, it's important for the UK. And I'm glad that the second question was perfectly positioned, Anna, because I think most folks see it as being important for the UK. But thirdly, we're going to try to convince you that, arguably we can't participate formally in the EHDS governance, but we can remain very influential in terms of, interoperability, standards, best practice, and remain very competitive alongside it. And I think this is really important for UK citizens, but also UK PLC. So that's what we're going to try and do. So we're going to do I think Tim and I are going to do a double act. So I'm the warm-up act for Tim, but if we kick off. Next slide, please. So what we're going to cover is four things, but I talked about 8 billion people. The EHDS covers 449 million people. So it's about, almost 500 million people that the 27 member states have got together. And as you know, the UK were very bijou, were 69 million people. And this is important because I would argue that some of the biggest health challenges facing humanity are either too big, too rare, too fast moving, or too cross-border for individual countries to deliver solutions by themselves. Let's take the COVID pandemic, and that illustrates the interdependence and connectiveness of countries across the world. And that's why this isn't just about rare disease. This isn't just about pandemics, but if we get this right, it could really act as an accelerator for all the things we want to do for society and humanity in terms of excellent healthcare provision. And I always say today's research is tomorrow's care. How do we create trustworthy research ecosystems? So what we're going to do is just briefly talk about the goals of the European health data space. Secondly, how have we got here? What approach has been taken to establish it? Thirdly, what are the opportunities and challenges for both member states and the UK? And most importantly, can we in the UK get our act together and organize ourselves so that we engage and influence and become almost an international partner of choice, whilst having humility in what we do? Okay, so next slide, please. The thing about the European health data space is that it's fantastic that we got Petra here today, because it's sort of rooted in law. This is not optional, it's enforceable in legal terms. So it's regulation, not just guidance. And I think that's an important point to get across. So what it seeks to do is to establish a common legal, technical, and governance framework for trustworthy use of electronic health data across Europe. So that, if people live in Holland, or the Netherlands, I should say, or on holiday in Portugal, how can their data be used and accessed across UK country borders for 449 million people, so-called primary data use? But also, as we know, collect data once, use it often in a trustworthy way. What are those consistent routes for secure and privacy-preserving use of health data, whether it's for drug safety, clinical trials, research, innovation, regulation, so-called secondary use? And this regulation came in force last year, about a year ago, and implementation is beginning across member states from 2027. Now, as you know, we are not in the EU, so my understanding is the UK won't be able to join formally until 2035. So the key now is to build relationships, partnerships, define best practice so that we can align and work in affiliation. Next slide, please. So what are these benefits? And I sort of touched upon these. You know, ideally, we're here to serve. So how do we support the care pathways of individual patients and citizens, and also be very transparent and honest, reliable, and competent in terms of how data are used, both for primary use and secondary use. Secondly, if you look at the best performing health systems internationally, they have real system and whole system surveillance to enable organizational efficiency and policy. So how do we use health data for public health and safety, and providing evidence synthesis that supports regulation and policy making? And thirdly, so that in our quest to assemble a trustworthy health data research ecosystem, how can researchers and innovators, including colleagues in industry, access health data at scale in a trustworthy way whilst ensuring benefit sharing at scale? Can you imagine a clinical trials platform for 449 million people? It would be amazing in terms of European competitiveness. Next slide, please. So what are the core elements as we move into this, what I call regulatory phase? So there is a European Health Data Science Board, which is an independent body. So it's a classical major EU decision-making body with representation from each member state and the EU Commission. But secondly, it's a sort of federated approach because every country has established a health data access body, which acts as the sort of national node between health data holders and authorized users for secondary data within each member state. And that ensures that legal, ethical, and data security safeguards are in place. I should say that in some countries, they go down to the regional level as well, because as you know, the data landscape is universally very fragmented. So some countries, there's both regional and national. But the way I see this is the metaphor is power stations on a grid. So every country will have its power station as part of this well-coordinated, regulated European grid. Key to this is standards, interoperability, technical standards, governance standards, public engagement consistency, contracting standards. So how are those legal, organizational, and service technical layers stacked up? And I would argue that other industry verticals have done this, where the incentives have been better aligned. For example, I could send Anna £100 in the next 10 minutes. I'm not going to, Anna. And that's because the financial services authorities, globally have a SWIFT system, which is a messaging system that allows transactions to take place in near real time. So we in health, we aspire to some of those functions, but one needs this connectedness to actually put it in place. Next slide, please. It will come eventually. There we go. And key to this is trustworthiness. And I think this is one area where the UK, through understanding patient data and other initiatives, put the citizen and the patient at the heart of everything we do in terms of public-patient engagement, the ability for choice in terms of opt-out, but also to ensure that the health data access bodies put security, safety, trustworthiness at the heart of everything we do. And of course, now through, and I think it's fair to say the UK's led a lot of the thought leadership on this in terms of trusted research environments, 5 safes. How do we have security in depth by embracing privacy enhancing technology so that trustworthy use of data and earning the social contract with the publics of Europe is at the forefront of this activity. Next slide, please. So we're moving into a regulatory phase. To roll the pitch is what I say. We had there's a body called Towards a European Health Data Space, which really provided the groundwork. And I think it's based out of Finland. And what TEDAS2 has been doing is doing a lot of the early work around principles and best practice, which would formulate the frameworks, which will then be adopted by the European Health Data Space. And we'll send details around of this website because there are existing guidelines and technical specifications which really articulate best practice so that it can be, so that EHDS wasn't starting with a blank sheet of paper. And that has also included public consultation. So a lot of the sort of groundwork of best practice, technical standards, how to engage the public, etc., has been done. So that's an important part of the narrative. Now, I think I seamlessly hand over to Tim now. So
that's correct.
Let's go to Tim.
Hi. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm the director of ELIXIR. ELIXIR is one of the European research infrastructures on the research side of the fence, but it touches on these projects which link to the European Health Data Space, which is why I'm talking about this. So this is just, if you think of the UK, you have the Health Ministry, Department of Health, you have the research funders, and you're trying to bridge in many ways between those. It's the same at the European level. There are actually 3 players involved in this project. There is the Director General of the Commission, DG Sante, which is the lead for the European Health Data Space. There is DG Connect, which is responsible for something called Digital Europe. And this is the lead for common European health data spaces in general. And there's many, and I'll show that on the next slide. And the entities that provide data within those frameworks are called EDICs. And there's one that ELIXIR is very familiar with that is beginning to be set up for genomes, for example, the Genome EDIC, which I'll come back to towards the end. And then there's the research side, DG RTD, which has a huge budget for Horizon Europe, is also connected with some of the funding of research infrastructures, although a lot of that funding comes coordinated from member states directly. And a lot of those research infrastructures are referred to as ERICs, European Research Infrastructure Consortia. They're legal entities, just like the EDICs. So these are the different players that will contribute to this. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Right. So the common European data spaces, this is just to make it clear that the European Health Data Space is just one of these data spaces that are planned. This is part of the kind of vision for Europe to, in many ways, create a common market for data. If you look at the list there, and that list probably is not, they keep adding new ones. It covers in many ways industrial data, pre-competitive data that might be shared between many manufacturing entities, societal data, obviously health, but things like agriculture, potentially environment, the Green Deal is there, energy for coordinated information about energy efficiency, etc., administration. These are all cases where there is data being collected societal data in many cases. It's not research, not specifically collected for research projects, where it's seen that there is going to be benefit for collective analysis in a secure way. And there's structures supporting this framework. So you can think of there's many different players going to be in this space, but there's a data space support center that's been set up by the Commission to support the development of all these. And there is a common open source framework called Simple. That's simple without the E, which is, it's quite active in providing the idea of having APIs across these data space, common APIs. So you can imagine doing health analysis along with social data, for example, or maybe to do with environmental data. The future will bridge between these. Should also mention one more thing with respect to this slide. The research world, DGRTD, also has something called EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, and you'll see projects related to that in a minute. EOSC is constructing something called the EOS Federation, which is a set of nodes offering services from the research world. And people are now talking about the EOSC Federation as being another data space, but with research data as opposed to societal data. Next slide. So the work to lead to this, to lead to the European health data space, builds on strong foundations, established programs and research initiatives, many of which the UK is involved in, because the UK is not in Digital Europe. It's not connected with DG Connect or DG Sante, but it is, of course, an associate member of Horizon Europe. So it is part of the funding streams and projects of DG RTD. And those projects, there's the research infrastructures, of which ELIXIR is one, but there's also the biobanking infrastructure, BBMRI. There's the European Infrastructure for Translational Research. So there are a number of these infrastructures dealing with research activity, many of which have learnings that feed into how do you handle this class of data. But there are specific projects that feed into this as well. The Quantum project, which is about common quality and utility labeling for health data sets in Europe. And then EHDS Trust, which actually ELIXIR coordinates, which is about trusted research environments. Specifically, we have a lot of familiarity in the UK with trusted research environments and the other names they're called, secure data environments in the NHS. But what do you do if you've got an environment like that in every country and you want to federate between them? So EHDS Trust is about trying to work out how you build cross-border structures for secure analysis, which is, of course, specifically relevant to the European health data space, because you're going to end up with data sets in different countries that you want to bring together for analysis, or you want to be able to analyze collectively without moving the data. Next slide. So this is a commission slide, but it just gives you an idea of the structure. Andrew's mentioned some of this. The health data access bodies, these HBACs, will sit in every country, maybe regional in some countries, and they will have catalogues, rather like what Health Data Research UK provides in its gateway of data sets that are available. It will have a process for asking for access, and the central platform will be able to ask multiple HBACs for access. And then SPEs. SPEs are like TREs. They're like trusted research environments. And it's the idea that data will be accessible through those. So the data won't move outside an SPE. But if you want to do analysis across different countries, then you're going to have to do federated analysis across those SPEs. There's some centralized things, just like the UK, we have some central collections. Obviously, the Commission is collecting things about from say EMA, and there'll be this union catalogue which will contain data from across the whole of the European Union for certain classes as well. There's boxes there showing authorised participants and third countries. So of course, Andrew's already mentioned the possibility over time of the UK being able to connect to this network and potentially federate with it. But there's also this authorised participants, which includes you probably can't see it on the slide, EDICs and ERICs. So these research infrastructures which contain data which is not specifically the health data space data, but is going to be associated with them. And I'll come back to that. Next slide. So these are the kind of things that we have to make work to, if you've got data in lots of different places, or like the secure data environments in the UK, these regional structures, how do you bridge between them? You have to have interoperability and standards. I've already mentioned quantum from that point of view. You have to have governance and trust. Of course, one of the nice things here is the whole idea of the European Data Space Regulation is meant to be that it builds on top of GDPR such that you end up with a unified implementation. So you don't end up with these different implementation problems in different countries. You obviously have to have international alignment. Well, this is all built on the EU, at least as the starting point. It's a regulation, everybody has to implement it. And the whole TEDS process has been, in many ways to build a harmonized approach, even if it's implemented in different ways in different countries. And finally, if you're going to do useful analysis, you have to have federation and secure access working. So next slide, because I'll show you now an example of where we are doing this, which is for the 1 Million Genomes Project, which is a research project scattered across 27 countries that ELIXIR has been coordinating most of the elements of. It's been a long time coming. The European genome data infrastructure in many ways is being built before the data was collected. The data is now being collected for research cohorts in the Genomes of Europe box, which you can see, the blue one in the middle of the screen. And now those yellow boxes at the end are the sort of latest sets of grants which are just being bid for to take what's been constructed. You have infrastructure to hold genomes, you have research genomes coming in, but the ultimate objective, of course, this will start to contain health genomes collected through and aligned with the European health data space for a subset of the population, just as is happening in the UK with the Genome Medicine Service and Genomics England, providing a slice of people who have genomes connected with the health system in the UK. And although there have been these projects that have been coordinated, can you do the next slide? Because it's not a slide, it's just an addition. So the first phases are coordinated by ELIXIR, which of course is a research entity. But the long-term expectation is there's going to be a legal entity, one of these EDICs, being part of the of DG Connect, which will be one of those associated partners of the European Health Data Space. So the European Health Data Space will cover all health records, but where there are genomes associated with that, it'll be possible to link to the specialized infrastructure that holds genomes, and then it will allow you to not just analyze health records across 430 million people, but also analyze collectively, at least as a starting point, 1 million genomes, and over time, progressively millions of genomes across Europe with the same sort of federated approaches. So what's being built right now is kind of some of the starting points before this gets implemented at the European health data space level. And we can already show examples of federated analysis across genomes in 6 countries, for example, for this existing infrastructure. Next slide. So opportunities for UK and EU. Obviously, the vision of this, it's potentially transformatory, to have this many people and to have a framework that allows you to basically link data across multiple countries without breaking privacy, because you do it in a federated way using secure processing environments across 430 million European citizens. But if you can make this work, you can also think of it being a model for the whole world. I sit on the technical advisory group of the WHO for genomes, and this is a potential mechanism. There are parts of infrastructure like the Federated European Genome Archive, which essentially is an open source solution which other countries can deploy outside the European Union, as long as it stays aligned with the federated designs inside European Health Data Space. It will be possible maybe to do federated analysis on a much wider scale across the world. All of this builds on a framework of public and patient benefit and trust. I think that's been established with this concept of not distributing the data. Data stays under the control of the country or region, but the analysis, the ability to analyze that without moving the data allows you to get benefits at scale and also deal with things like very rare conditions such as rare disease, where there aren't going to be many cases across individual countries. And of course, for the UK, obviously we have a lot of history in the genomes world and also the health data world. We have HDRS now being built. We might be ahead now, but this is going to come up from behind with much larger data sets. It's very sensible to align ourselves with them and make sure that we all collectively benefit both with our knowledge, but also the scales of data that are being organized. And I'll pass back to Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And I'll go on to my last slide, I think, and then we'll focus, because I think the UK can work in partnership with European colleagues with a long track record of how to use data in a trustworthy way. And not only that, but with recent government support and investments into data as infrastructure. And arguably the best example of that was the announcement of the Health Data Research Service, you'll all be familiar with, which is fantastic news for the UK, announced by the Prime Minister a year ago, which is beginning to assemble its priorities in terms of how do we scale this in a reliable, interoperable, secure way, so that we can really nurture and cultivate the next generation of research innovation for patient and public benefit. And it's great that Melanie and Baroness Blackwood are now in post. And final slide, I think I've got one final slide. It's just to emphasize that there's lots of great stuff in the UK happening, in terms of how we have harnessed data at scale to address important issues. We already have a network of trusted research environments, which are very similar to the secure processing environments advocated by the European Health Data Space. But most importantly, we've got the people. We've got outstanding patient and public organizations. We've got the research community working in partnership with NHS and industry to try and really accelerate the secure use of health data at scale. And if we can align ourselves and engage with Europe in a strategic way, I think we can influence and act as an accelerator for the European health data space. So that's the proposition, and I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Tim. That was really helpful introduction and overview. I really appreciate that. Moving on, so I think we're slightly behind on the timing already. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Petra Wilson, who's Managing Director of Health Connect Partners and is an expert in legal and regulatory frameworks, and obviously will give us a bit of a background introduction to how this has all come about. So over to you, Petra.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I will speed up a little bit to try and gain back a little bit of time. But as you know, you are going to be having these slides. So you're very welcome to put a question in the chat. We'll come back to it. And also you'll have the slides to look at later. So if I could have the next slide, please. This is just an overview of what I'm going to cover, so we don't need to spend time on that. If I take the next slide. What I'd like to do is take a step back from what Andrew and Tim have presented about the detail of the EHDS to say, well, what's it actually based on? Every European law has to have its basis in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. The EU doesn't have the right to make legislation unless that right is established within the TFEU. Now, the EHDS is a little bit unusual because it actually bases itself on 3 articles of the TFEU, and that already gives you an idea of its complexity. Central to it is Article 114, which says that the EU is an objective of the EU is to create an internal market. And here the idea is to create an internal market for the tools, notably EHRs, that will make the EHDS function. But it's also based on the free movement of goods, services, and people. Now, obviously, people here means patients and health professionals, but it's also important to remember that the European Court of Justice has decided that healthcare services are services which are allowed to move subject to Article 26. And then, as we've already noted, and Andrew stressed this, the EHDS necessarily processes sensitive data, so Article 16 of the TFEU on data protection is key. But, and there is a massive big but, and that's why it's a red at the bottom, there is also Article 168, which says that the EU can only make law in the context of cross-border care, and it can encourage cooperation between member states, but it can't ask member states to realign their healthcare systems in order to deliver European objectives. This is known as the subsidiarity principle, and it's what creates some of the challenges in actually making cross-border care work. A particular example of it in the EHDS is that while there is an opt-out right that exists for secondary use of data, when it comes to primary use, so use of data for delivering healthcare, it's up to member states to decide whether or not they're going to offer an opt-out of that data. So there is a tension there, and it's a tension that is sometimes difficult, and member states protect their right to organize their own healthcare systems very fiercely. If I go on to the next slide, I'm going to take us back quite a long time to 1998. Where did all this come from? Where did the idea of cross-border healthcare come from? Well, it's important to note that the idea of social security portability actually goes right back to 1958. There was a principle that if citizens move across borders to work, then they should be able to take their social security with them. And so there was always a right to access healthcare over borders in that context. What changed in the late 1990s and is still being debated in the courts now is when a person chooses to go to another country, specifically to get healthcare, or when they are in another country and an accident happens and they want to access healthcare, and it's not emergency services, but they want to access regular primary healthcare. That's the Cole Decker and later Gerrit Smits cases, which established in the European Court that these rights were rights covered by Article 26, so the free movement of people, and that healthcare services are services that could be accessed in this way. There's actually around 50 cases. I've just given you 4 here that are of interest. But what happened then is that the EU got a bit of a political allergy, saying that it's not for the European Court of Justice to make European law. And so they codified this into the Cross-Border Care Directive, which is Directive 2011-24. If I could have the next slide, please. That is a law that really is the basis, and it's referred to repeatedly within the EHDS, and it sets the framework for cross-border care. But it falls short in some certain ways. Firstly, the rules are very complex, and it's hard for ordinary patients and doctors to understand exactly what's covered, and importantly, what sort of payment may be covered. But then when it comes to the data that is needed to provide healthcare safely, it really falls short, because it created a voluntary data sharing mechanism, which was not adopted across all countries. The data sharing mechanism was really rather limited. And more importantly, really I think for us and for research, is it assumed that a healthcare cross-border only happens when people physically travel, so when you move to another country, rather than when you might just need care across a border because the healthcare professional that could best look after you is based in another country, but could perfectly well provide that care through a telemedicine solution or other solution. That's where the law was found to fall short. in terms of healthcare, and that's where the EHD stepped in. But next slide, please. It didn't only fall short on healthcare delivery, it also fell short on data protection issues. And there are 4 particular issues that a European Union study that was done prior to the adoption of the EHDS and was really a catalyst for the EHDS being adopted showed. And it showed that the way in which the GDPR sets out to protect health-related data made it very slow for a person to access their own records and to share records for their care. That was then amended in the EHDS. It created a patchwork set of rules on secondary use because it was very much left up to member states how to implement access to data for secondary use. And it particularly, it created a problem in terms of data portability because data portability rights under the GDPR are related to consent. And in the healthcare setting, we don't actually usually collect data on the basis of consent. We collect it on the basis of either contract or a legal basis. A physician needs data in order to treat you properly. And because of these shortcomings, the EHDS, if I may have the next slide, was adopted, and it sought to address 3 big pillars. Now, both Andrew and Tim have already given a bit of coverage on this, so I won't go into detail, but it's important to see that what it sought to do was give patients better power of their own data, so patient empowerment, build a real internal market. I've mentioned Article 114 of the treaty, and also, and I think very importantly for us here today, drive better use of data for research and policy in a way that builds patient trust. And I think that's one of the key things that we want to take away and examine together. Does it go far enough in building patient trust on the use of data? Because if it doesn't, patients will exercise their right to opt out of data being used for research, and then that research database will be diminished. If I could take the next slide, please. We've already taken a little bit of detail on this. How can data actually be used for secondary uses for research and policy making? I think what's important here is that although the EHDS begins from a basis of using data generated from electronic health records for primary use, the idea is that in due course, the data will become much richer, that it will be more than data from EHRs. It will start to bring in genomic data, clinical trials data, data from the wellness apps that a patient might voluntarily submit to it. There is also the idea that that comes from another piece of law called the Data Governance Act, that there should be platforms where patients can donate all sorts of data for research purposes, including health data. So the idea is that there will be a very rich database in due course. And one important thing to note is that there is this principle that if as a user you use data through the EHDS and you enrich that data, that might be by correcting any mistakes in it, labeling it in a more user-friendly way, or in fact develop secondary data, or if you like, tertiary data from that database, then that also feeds back into the EHDS. So over time, it should grow. We've heard a little bit about the HDABs, the Health Data Access Bodies, and how they are going to work together. Important perhaps to note is that some countries have decided to have a series of Health Data Access Bodies. Some of those are geographical, but some, notably Germany, have said that they're going to have a separate health data access body for genomic data. So there may be some interesting variations there. The last point that I really want to make is that, as I've already mentioned, ensuring that citizens, patients trust that data is used properly, that the data is controlled in a proper way is absolutely key. So I think what is really important that as the UK thinks about how it might enter the EHDS, that preceding that, we really do our utmost to build trust in secondary use of data. And let me then finish with my last slide, and I hope I've managed to garner a bit more time back for us. But on the last slide, what are the big takeaways from here? First thing that I mentioned is that the EHDS is based in the treaties. And whilst we often in the healthcare sector think very much about the primary and secondary use of data, I think it's really important for us to remember that a core function of it is to create an internal market for digital health. The European Courts of Justice will stand behind this legislation just as they did behind the rights under the treaty that led to the creation of the Cross-Border Care Directive. So we can expect the ECJ in due course to come up with rulings that will enhance our understanding of the EHDS. The GDPR protects privacy well, but it was found to fall short of what patients and clinicians and researchers needed. And we really hope that the EHDS can address all of those. And I think the last thing is that it creates a really coherent set of legislation that helps patients control their data. And through that control, hopefully builds the trust that is needed in the system. And with that, I think I've just about finished my slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. That's super insightful and really, really thorough. I really appreciate that. On to John Meredith, who's an interoperability specialist at the Digital Health Excellence Centre. He's going to talk us through some of the policy and infrastructure challenges in creating a connected Europe.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here. Yes, so I'm an interoperability specialist at Ernst & Young's DEC. It's a terrible acronym when you think about it. Put in a H in front of it, an E and a C. I'm also the technical design lead for the EHDS Support Centre for the European EHR Exchange format. And if anybody's interested in having a chat to me about that, by all means, please shout out on LinkedIn or whatever. That's an interesting project because it's been commissioned to support the implementation of the interoperability standard. My perspective really today is very much about the design and delivery. I'm less, I'm not going to go through the regulations and, we've heard things like that. But the point I want to make is that usable exchanges do not appear just because the regulation exists. Or because we have a standard or with a logo on it or something along those lines. It happens when policy and standards and delivery capability are brought together in a way that people can actually implement and operate. And ultimately, this means systems can communicate. So next slide, please. So Europe is raising the expectation, the practical expectation, I suppose, that health data should move more safely, more consistently, and with more transparency across borders. And for the UK, the key question is not about, legal membership. The key question is about the strategic compatibility. So in other words, are our architectures, our data sets, governance arrangements, delivery models, and so on and so forth, aligned with that direction of travel in the wider environment around us? And that matters because the direction of travel affects more than just legislation. It affects standards choices, supplier roadmaps, implementation patterns, and public expectations about how data sharing ought to work. So my opening point is that the UK does not need to be inside EHDS for the EHDS to shape the environment we are building on. And interoperability is becoming part of the operating environment around the UK, not just a European policy discussion. So next slide, please. So if we accept that, the obvious next question then is what actually turns policy direction into something operational? So between policy and practice sits a delivery stack. At the top, you've got the policy, the regulation, the rights, and so on. That gives you the direction, the obligations, and the intended outcomes, but that's only the start. Then you need specifications and assurances in the form of datasets, profiles, implementation guidance, conformance rules, validation, logging, and other things like testable outcomes and expectations. In other words, you need to translate the ambition into something that can actually be built and then assessed. And below that, then you need services and delivery capabilities such as identity, access, routing, registries, or a whole host of different things there that then can be turned into products, workflows, and provide a capability, a digital tooling capability for clinical settings. So that's why interoperability failures are really just technical. A lot of these things are not technical problems. The hard work usually sits in the middle and the lower parts of this stack. It's around the governance, it's around the implementation, and then how those things are actually operating within it. Next slide. So to make this more concrete and to help separate into different kinds of interoperability, this is what I've spent probably a decade sort of trying to convince people about, is that interoperability is not one thing. And I don't want to get too complicated here, but this is really important to actually bear out. So, at the center here, you've got those three concentric rings. Technical interoperability is actually the mechanics of the exchange itself. Can systems connect? Can they move messages back and forth? Can they identify endpoints and exchange securely? We've had technical interoperability in healthcare for decades. That's not something that needs to be solved. The issue you've got is that that's just the start. So then we move into semantic interoperability. So does the receiving side understand the data in the same way? Is it unambiguous? Are we preserving meaning through shared models, coded values, terminologies, and agreed definitions? The third important pillar then is the clinical process. Can this be information used in a real clinical workflow? Can it be used safely? Does it arrive at the right point of care with the right provenance, timing, context, so that somebody can act upon it? And then wrapped around that, we've got sort of the fourth and fifth pillar. Depending on which definition you go for, there's a fourth pillar of interoperability, which is organizational. But interestingly, EHDS actually separates the legal implementation from the organizational. So these layers, though, they're vital because people can usually underplay their importance. We're talking about governance, accountability, the operating model, capability, and all those sorts of things, as well as access rules, audit, and transparency. So the point I'd emphasize in this is that interoperability is not a standards problem. It is workflow and governance and delivery problem. And those fourth and fifth sort of concentric rings there are vital because that's where humans sit. And organizational and change management problems and so on and so forth, which is frequently the problem. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into too much detail about all of these standards, but just to say that all of those logos you can see there are a standard of of some sort. And a technical exchange format is not the same as a terminology. A terminology is not the same as a workflow pattern, and none of these on their own solves governance or delivery. So when people say interoperability standards, they're often bundling things together, and these are very different things. HL7's FIRE standard, for example, mainly helps with structural exchange. SNOMED CT, LOINC, or ICD sit in the semantic space. They help preserve meaning, classification, and comparability. OpenAIR stretches differently because it's not just a message format or a terminology. It starts to bridge the idea of structured meaning into a persistent clinical lingua franca that then helps support workflow use. So, this is not an exhaustive sort of list of standards here. There are more that you could potentially add in, but it's just showing that familiar standards and artifacts sit in different parts of this problem space. Next slide, please. I'd like to focus a little bit on the public digital infrastructure side of things, because I think this is important. What we're trying to do here is shift the lens a little bit. So instead of thinking about interoperability as a set of point-to-point integrations or as a feature that's inside one application, public digital infrastructure sort of helps us see it as a set of shared governed foundations that many services can then rely on. So when we talk about foundational shared capabilities, such as digital identity and authentication, provider, organizational or location registries, and so on and so forth, the important point is that not just that these things exist, but they're shared, reusable, and governed. And that matters because once we agree something basic and govern it properly, for example, like a common API standard for health data, it stops being just another technical choice. It becomes part of a foundation on which better services can be built on top of. So in other words, if we all agree a standard way to exchange health data and we all agree the rules around how that is used, validated, and relied upon, then it becomes a platform for service improvement rather than just an interface specification. And that's the real value of framing this as PDI. It underlines the imperatives of a basic governance standard and a shared expectation that can be built upon. So when the slide says that apps and EHRs are only visible from the front end, that is really the point. That's the framing that people think of things through. But it matters in the EHDS context, because EHDS is setting the direction for direction of travel for common obligations, and then that is then turned into reality by the exchange format itself, which forms itself as a technical specification. I suppose though, member states still need to share national or regional capabilities to make this exchange usable in practice. So, it's public digital infrastructure at this level is really that governed foundation. Next slide. So I want to just turn to the example of a patient summary. It's quite a useful idea. It's also oversimplified, but when you unpack it, you actually start to see some of the complexity, because you have to identify the person and the treating professional. You have to find the right source system or service. You have to request the agreed data set. You then have to exchange both a machine-readable contact, so system A speaks to system B and it can understand what that data entails, but also you may have a human-readable artifact. You have to preserve the provenance, the metadata encoding. Then you have to present it safely inside a local clinical workflow. So this teaches us really that the exchange format alone is not enough. The dataset matters, the metadata around that dataset matters, identifiers matter, terminology matters, access and control, conformance, governance, and operational ownership matter. This is also why this example is close to the UK discussion. John Farrington's on this call, for example, and he and I helped co-organize an international patient summary hackathon in Leeds recently. International patient summary again is one of these similar sorts of things where it's a very effective target to paint for us to actually stretch to from a technical perspective. And again, it's not technical problem, it's agreement that we are going to actually all conform to that way of working. Next slide, please. So EHDS is not just about back and forth exchange, it's also challenges how people and professionals prove who they are, access information, and understand how that access is controlled. So I'd frame patient governance in three parts. First, in terms of identity, reliable proof of who the person or the professional was, trusted access to the right services at the right time. The second then is about control, clear permissions, visible choices, and understandable access rules, so people have confidence about what is being shared, with whom, and for what purpose. The third then is about safe access, authentication, authorization, logging, notification, and other support. It's not about abstract controls, but as services that people can actually use. So the patient governance becomes real through verified identity and controlled retrieval and audit and safe access. It's not simply about rights that are written down in a policy. So one of the key problems though that we have is how you actually do this for real. So the next slide is hopefully going to paint that picture. The visible part of everything that's above the iceberg here are things that probably people can get their heads around and people have had experience of. So the agreed data sets, the technical exchange format, the formal specifications, they're all absolutely vital, of course. But real exchange programs quickly discover that the deeper implementation burden actually lies below the water level there. So you need provenance, you need to know where the information came from, who created it, when, and in what context. You need those access controls. You need coding and meaning to line up across systems. You need things like a life cycle status so that you can make sure information is important to use. Think about the life cycle of an API. When something gets superseded or deprecated, as we say, are you using the old API? All of these things can actually start to mount up to actually place a burden in terms of the technical challenge. So the point of this slide really is quite straightforward. Sending a data set over an API is really only a small part of the job. The visible artifacts matter, but the larger body of work that sits underneath them is what determines whether or not the exchange is safe, governable, and then durable. So that takes us now to my closing point. So policy intent sets the direction, the rights and the duties and the outcomes that Europe wants from health data exchange. That intent then has to be translated into shared specifications, implementation guidance, and conformance rules. But that's still not enough. Real implementation will always expose gaps. There'll be trade-offs, awkward edge cases, and those lessons have to be fed back then into the guidance, governance and policy. And member states still need the services and the governance and the funding and the delivery capability to make any of this work in practice. So publishing the rules is only the beginning. The EHDS works when the policy and the guidance and delivery keep learning from each other. And this is something that is going to evolve over time. And that matters for the UK because Europe is shaping those expectations around data sharing and transparency and trust. We're all, the work I discussed about the hackathon, for example, means that NHS England is also looking at this, but this is a UK-wide issue. And if we think about the challenge of cross-border, we have real-world use cases already. Patients in Northern Ireland, for example, may be referred to the Republic of Ireland. That's squarely in EHDS. So the closing message really is that, we don't have to be inside the EHDS for the EHDS to shape the environment that we are building in. And it just seems like it's a pretty good idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I've never seen interoperability explained so clearly and beautifully. I really appreciate that. So next up, we've got Dr. Claire Bloomfield, who's Principal for Data and Technology Partnerships at Isomorphic Labs, to talk about how the HDS might supercharge sort of drug discovery and the AI innovation.
Thanks, Anna. Although this is sort of an attempt to give you an insight into a little bit of the AI research and innovation potential use cases for the European health data space, obviously, as this AI generated image will give you a sense, there's a lot of complexity and opportunity across the AI space specifically, but even more broadly across the research utility of patient-derived data. I'm not going to attempt to try and talk to you about all of this complexity that's sort of visualized on this slide, but it really does span everything from the top left of how we think about discovering new drugs, which I'll talk to you about in a bit more detail, through devices and diagnostics. So how do we pick up diseases sooner or more accurately to support patients receiving better care, through to actually just then optimizing the way that care is delivered, either directly in terms of interactions with patients and clinicians, as well as about how clinical trials are optimized themselves. And then finally, sort of speaking to some of the patients and participants sort of attending this talk, how we even talk to and engage with the public and patients around their data. And chatbots, for their sins or successes, are an increasing presence in terms of how we engage with different parts of the system. And again, provide an opportunity for a more rapid or streamlined engagement for where patients can directly understand what is happening that impacts them and support them in making decisions about their health. This is, as I say, a snapshot of some of the range of AI-supported use cases. Above and beyond that, we have everything from charity, third sector, university, blue sky fundamental research, all which can benefit from access to and use of data that's derived from patients' journeys. And it's really, I think, as Andrew said at the start, how we go from today's research is tomorrow's care. This is the real focus of the potential that we can unlock through resources like the European health data space. If we go to the next slide, please. As Anna said, I'm not going to try and talk to you about all research and innovation in 10 minutes. So I thought I'd attempt a little bit of how can AI support disrupting the status quo and unlock benefits for patients through drug discovery, particularly, which is the focus of the company that I work for, Isomorphic Labs. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of what Isomorphic does, and then a little bit of some of the current challenges and problems facing the system about how we actually develop and bring drugs to patients that will benefit them, and how AI can support at all stages of that journey. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Isomorphic Labs. We have a broad and far-reaching ambition to one day solve all disease with the help of AI. That is a lofty ambition, but one that really we are dedicated to delivering on, and believe that that is potentially within our grasp over a significant period of time, by really thinking about how we reimagine the way that we develop and design drugs from first principles, so that we can develop better, deeper scientific insights, we can move faster, and we can have more life-changing medicines brought to patients that need them. So really thinking about how can we do this more quickly, more accurately, and with better outcomes for patients. And we've been focusing on how we build that, particularly around some of the way that we design molecules or the drugs that we work with developing to get those to patients. And I'll give you a bit of an example in some of the next slides. So that's isomorphic's specific ambition and approach within this landscape, but it sits within the wider context and problems that we're facing as an industry around how do we support patients in living happier, healthier lives through providing better drugs. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you a sense of the status quo. This is something that I live and breathe every day, but is not something that you would be exposed to if you're an average patient or member of the public. So a little bit of sort of the context of where are we in terms of how we develop medicines currently. On the left-hand side is something we called Erum's law, which is actually the inverse of something that is more widely known, which is Moore's law, that has shown that the cost of computing has continued to decrease over time very, very rapidly. And that's how we've seen the explosion in innovations that we've seen off the back of things like the internet, wider use of mobile phones, all sorts of technological breakthroughs. The inverse of that, unfortunately, is what we're seeing in medicine development, in that the cost of medicines is increasing year on year. And actually, it's getting more and more expensive to produce no greater number of medicines for patients. So we're broadly doing a worse job, but it's costing us more money. And that's really not a situation that we can afford as an ecosystem, to see that only 10% of the discoveries we make in the laboratories make their way through to patients. And that's that funnel of failure on the right-hand side, that from the very earliest stages of people in labs running experiments to discover new biological insights, through to the far end to actually see those be successfully brought through to come to market to benefit patients, we're only seeing about 10% of those actually getting all the way through that process, which in any other industry would be seen as a huge failure, and we'd stop and we'd be trying to do something entirely different. We've been doing that, though, for a number of years across the ecosystem in pharma and life sciences, and we really do need to disrupt that status quo so that we can actually help ensure that patients benefit from new discoveries and those make them all the way through a much more efficient way. So looking at this funnel a little bit more in detail, you can see that at the start, that's the full 100% of all discoveries we're finding, and that slowly decreases down into that very narrow funnel at the other end. And there are things we can intervene at all points along that funnel to improve the chances that we can actually bring drugs to patients that need them. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how AI and data can enable those. So if we look at the next slide, please. The first thing is, can we make safe drugs? Can we help ensure that when we bring drugs first into patients, which is what is called a phase 1 clinical trial, that we can actually ensure they are safe and not toxic, and they will work in the way that we hope they do in terms of being safe for patients? Currently, about 60 to 70% of drugs that have gone all the way through the earlier stages of discovery and development fail at this point because they don't work in patients in terms of having safety and toxicity profiles that actually reflect humans. And so we've seen increasingly there have been a number of new innovations that have come through from AI companies that have improved that from a 40% success rate to an 80 to 90% success rate. So we're really cracking the safety challenge that the industry has been facing for a long time. And the reason that we've been able to do that is unlocking the value hidden in large amounts of data. At the core of isomorphic labs is the development and pursuit of the AlphaFold model that was published, and our CEO Demis was received a Nobel Prize for, was unlocking how we understand proteins in deep detail through AI and machine learning, and that allows us to design better molecules that are more safe for patients. And we're not alone in pursuing this, but it's a similar sort of story of how can we leverage the large amounts of dark data that we see across the healthcare system to unlock similar types of initiatives across a different range of use cases. And the European health data space really can provide that volume, as sort of Andrew and Tim were alluding to at the start, that allows us to have that scale of discovery. This database that supported the protein structure understanding was about 250,000 protein structures. We need substantially more to understand the complexity of human biology, but this is a real great space in terms of understanding the starting point of, can we make drugs that are safe for people? If we then think about not only can we make drugs that are safe for people, can we make drugs for people that actually work and do the thing we need to do in terms of intervening in disease? That's where we see the next phase of the drug discovery journey progress, and where data can also help. So if we look at the next slide, please. This is where we've got a huge potential, but still further to go. And this is ensuring that we have effective drugs so they actually reverse the bad effects we're seeing in disease and can support patients in recovering or living healthier lives. around 70 to 80% of all drugs fail at this point. So if we've managed to make it through safety, we still see a substantial drop off at this point where many drugs are not making their way through. And that's because in the past, we've relied very heavily on animal models and non-human data to understand biology. And really, we need to make a shift to a human-first approach and leveraging this human data to help us understand human disease. It seems like an obvious, but it hasn't been the way we've done it historically. But we do benefit from a range of technologies and capabilities that have not existed before the last 20 or 30 years. Tim alluded to the investment in European health data space around genomic data, and that's going to be a really critical asset because we know from previous studies that if a drug has human genetic evidence and support that it will work, it's 2 times more likely to make it through that phase 2 clinical trial, which may sound like a small amount if you're going from 10% to 20%, but that is dramatically increasing our current success rates. And we know that you can go further than this by understanding cell-specific genetic perturbations or changes. And so there's really still more space we can unlock from understanding human biology, human disease at the cell, tissue, and whole patient level to help us drive new discoveries that we know will be more likely to be successful. And this is where the UK has provided great depth in terms of the capabilities it's built in genomic sequencing, but allowing us to get to greater scale and variability across the whole of Europe has real potential to help us go even further and unlock new discoveries. So if we can have safe drugs and we can have drugs that work, we still need to make sure they get to the right patients. So if we jump to the next slide. This piece is really about which is the right patient to give that medicine to and refining how we're approaching not only getting the biologically right signal and chemically the right signal, but it's the right individual patient that will benefit. And historically, that's not been the case. We've taken a one-size-fits-all approach to clinical trials. And so even where some of the biology works, it's not working for everybody. And by using NHS and European health data, that's real world data, so that from patients undergoing care currently, we can understand much more clearly who are the patients that are likely to benefit and make sure we design the medicines that will impact them, and where it won't help them, that we ensure that they're given other options where that's possible. Not only do we want to make sure it's the right patient, but we also want to make sure it's at the right time where we can speed this process up. So at the moment, it takes 10 to 15 years to take an idea from discovery all the way through into getting regulatory approval. AI can support us in going much quicker. The MHRA in the UK has already shown that with certain reforms they're making, they can cut the time to approval by 50%. And also European health data space has evidence showing that they can speed up the average time to deliver those trials by as much as 12 weeks. You do that with enough trials over enough time, you're really speeding up overall the chances we can get more drugs to patients quicker. And this is the sort of reflected in some of the legislative work that the European health data space has done already to suggest that they can have a 40% reduction in the timelines overall, which means 3 to 6 months faster for getting those medicines to patients, as well as saving a lot of cost to the system. So we believe that AI can help us get the right drugs that are safe and effective, and we can get them to the right patients and much quicker time frame by unlocking the potential of the data that exists, not only for individual patient care, but also for these research and innovation use cases. So just to summarize on my last slide, I think throughout what you'll have heard across all of these talks is there's great things we've done already within the UK. There are many things we can still do and benefit from between how we collaborate effectively with the rest of Europe. Even if we can't be a core part of that European health data space, we can learn from them, they can learn from us. Fortunately, we've seen some great alignment around secure data environments to ensure that some of those technical components and standards are coordinated across the two so that we don't create two systems that can't talk to each other. But there are areas we can go further. I've talked a little bit around the potential value of genomic data to support novel discoveries, but we think there's even further we can go. There are new technologies and new capabilities emerging that we should harness not just for patient care, but for these research components as well. And that's where we've got real potential to see the UK and Europe leapfrog the rest of the global community in terms of research and innovation. And so working to define those and think about how we unlock more of that potential is a real opportunity. we've also found, we've heard a bit about sort of the space for global interoperability, and I think it's great to see that we are seeing some alignment already across that. That means that from a technical perspective as well as an ambition perspective, there's huge scope for us to work together. And if we want to really focus on how we solve the world's hardest diseases, we really need a system that reflects the complexity of the humans we're aiming to help. And so coming together and collaborating effectively is going to be a really key opportunity for the UK and Europe. Thank you so much, Anna.
That wasn't a compelling reason for us to align with EHDS. I don't know what is. Thank you so much, Claire. That was fantastic. I think we're moving into Q&A now, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lucy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise in the different subjects. It's been incredibly interesting, quite a broad but thorough range of topics related to the EHDS. So we are now moving into the Q&A. I believe that Andrew has had to whiz off, but we are still joined by Tim Hubbard, Director of ELIXIR, Dr. Petra Wilson, who is the Managing Director of Health Connect Partners, John Meredith, Interoperability Specialist at the Digital Health Excellence Centre, and Dr. Claire Bloomfield, who's Principal for Data and Technology Partnerships at Isomorphic Labs. Perfect. So I'm going to get started with a couple of questions that we feel will be quite pertinent in the space. But please do start dropping your own questions into the Q&A, and we can get those answered by our experts on today's call. So the first question that we have for all of the speakers is, what does the European Health Data Space mean for the Health Data Research Service? Anyone who fancies taking a whiz at that one first? Tim, go for it.
Well, I mean, I think they align quite closely. I mean, this is an attempt with the HDRS to have a single national entity, and that's what is being planned in the European health data space per country. The key thing is, well, obviously there's a delay in interactions, but as long as we can at least stay aligned on protocols and interoperability, federation analysis, then I think there's no reason why the two systems can't interact.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. Any other speakers who would like to come to that point? John?
Yeah, I echo that. For me as a sort of a data architect or clinical data modeler, it's the painting that target on that how to describe data and is really, really vital. What I found in my career is that designing for secondary use usually is the tail wagging the dog. But of course, if you design with the intent of secondary use as well as primary use, you have something that's far more resilient, far more durable. So for me, it's almost like the symbolism of what the EHDS could represent is where the value comes from, because it starts getting us aligned into saying, right, we need to head in that direction, and we're going to describe data in those ways.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. Petra, I can see you've come off mute as well. Did you want to add anything further in there?
Yeah, I guess what I want to say is less scientific and a bit more political and legal. It gives the opportunity it gives opportunity full stop, but then it particularly gives the opportunity for the UK to step in to really shape the way in which interaction with so-called third countries is going to go forward. And I think it's really important that we grab that space, because there will be other countries that want to shape how third country interaction works. I think we have a particular opportunity because we have a good history with the European Union and Commission. We have some baseline legal alignment already with, for example, the GDPR, and having had our status as our legislation being equal to European legislation, having had that reinforced in December. But I think it's really important that we also realise that there are some countries that may want to take a different approach and that may want to try and weaken some of the safeguards that are embedded in the EHDS. And it's really important, I think, that we start to help shape that for the other countries that we may want to interact with in future. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks very much, Petra. I know Anna will be speaking to sort of what work UPD is doing around third countries towards the end of the session as well, which is very exciting. Claire, did you want to come in with any final remarks on HRS, or should we move to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's been said that there is real opportunity and there is certainly some synergies. I think across both of them, actually, it's going to be how do they not only catch up with other parts of the world, but leapfrog some of this. And so as much as there are, it's great to see alignment around some of the basics. I think the interesting thing for me will be how across those two, they can come together and think about how to be globally competitive. So again, within the sort of constraints of sort of talk about sovereign AI and other, how do we still balance the sort of collaboration and open system across UK and EU and to remain competitive to others? So I think that's going to be an interesting one to watch rather than a sort of it's clear how the alignment's going to work.
Yeah, so sort of getting an understanding of alignment and different competitiveness as well. Great, thank you very much. And then we have another question that we just wanted to present to you before we go into attendee questions. People in the Q&A, please do keep popping your questions in there. But we'd also like to get an idea of what effect you think the European health data space will have on single patient records. John, I know you touched on this slightly when you were speaking to the HDRS. But would anyone like to come in on EHDS and the single patient record?
Yeah, if I could chip in there. Like I said about painting the target, what's great if you look at the prioritized data sets, which I didn't really go into detail about, but basically there are prioritized data sets that cover patient summary, electronic prescription, electronic dispensation, lab test results. You've got medical imaging and imaging reports and discharge reports. Now, if you take all of those things together, you kind of got the outline of a longitudinal patient record, and that for me is the golden goose, so to speak. Because if we all agree on conformance on those artifacts, actually that's a great starter for 10. You know, that allows you to effectively be treated wherever you go. Now, the construction of those data points and the exact, the data structures, I suppose, is something that is evolving, and that hasn't been finalized. But just, if we've got that, then we've almost got our baseline, and I think that's the key element here. The single patient record has to exist in that way. And there's a common phrase that myself and colleagues tend to say from an interoperability perspective is we've been very guilty of trying to boil the ocean historically, and it's like, oh, we've got to figure this interoperability thing out. It's like, right, break it down into smaller chunks, and those priority data sets are smaller chunks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. Anyone else want to add on to what John has just shared there about the different sort of assets and chunks that we should be prioritizing?
So, of course, it is more complicated across Europe because you've got a whole range of different health systems, different implementations in different places. But there are commonalities like OMOP, for example. That's as the sort of standard that a lot of the SDEs are trying to move to in the UK. And OMOP was supported under an Eden project of IMI for many years. So there's a lot of building on that. And in many ways, also, people can move at different speeds. I think, we won't get uniform interoperability across the whole EU member state structure for some time. But, if you start with coalitions are willing to some extent in terms of standardization, then I think you can build on that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sean. Sorry, Tim. Any further remarks on single patient record? No? Okay, so let's move into our attendees questions then. So Spelagordek has asked, what is the most immediate thing we should be focusing on in this space? That's quite a tough one, quite a broad question, but in your respective areas, any sort of key item that we should be focusing on in this space that comes to mind?
I would say participation. I mean, the TEDS 3 thing has been flagged by Andrew. Be aware of what's going on. There is a lot going on. And at the wider level, I mentioned this is not just, obviously people on this call will be interested in the health data, but it's not just health. There's a much wider ambition here. And that does align with ambitions in the UK going beyond health into, years ago, the Administrative Data Task Force, more recently, the Administrative Data, I can't remember what it's called right now, but anyway, going beyond just health. So watch what Europe's doing in this space and align with it. And be part of the conversation in terms of how to implement it, because we do have a lot of experience in the UK.
And do you think that also links to digital ID in the UK too, when you speak about sort of the different aspects that are popping up?
Well, there is EID in the EU, and we do have IDs in the UK, for different purposes. If you can, we've had these missteps in the UK over, care.data and things like that, and people are very sensitive about this. But it is the way the world is going.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. Petra?
I was getting ready to say that I think the most important thing that we actually need to do is right from the beginning build up trust of clinicians, researchers and patients. But actually, I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that there is this new European legislation called the EU identity wallet, and there's a whole infrastructure to go with it. And I think if we can do anything to support patients in having a mechanism for sharing data using a standardized identity tool, that would be great. Because one of the things I'm very aware of is that a lot of UK patients will travel abroad with a GHIC card in their pockets, thinking that this will really facilitate access to care. But actually, all the GHIC card really is a proof that you're insured and possibly that your bills will be paid. It does nothing to facilitate data sharing. And I think we need to try and do something to move away from that. And maybe some sort of a voluntary engagement with the EU identity wallet could be helpful there.
Thank you, Petra. So really thinking about sort of trust, transparency, and the communication that is needed as we develop in this area. John?
I think one of the key things, so giving a shout out for the support centre, the project that I'm involved with, part of that support centre, there's a community of practice, and that's focused at vendors mainly. But part of that work is about that collaboration, and so I think it's an opportunity really to actually focus on those prioritized data sets and really start to figure out how compatible they are with the way that we think we should structure data across the UK. And I think, there probably won't be any major gremlins hiding, in there. But certainly I think it allows us to focus our minds and use it as prior art as well when we are having interoperability and data standards discussions ourselves. So, there is the opportunity to collaborate there, and vehicles by which that can be made possible for us in the UK.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. And finally, I'll come to yourself, Claire.
So unsurprisingly, I'm going to suggest some research use cases would be a great place to start from the European health data space, but I recognise that's one bias within this. I think across Europe, there's been a lot of alignment on cross-government legal frameworks, assessments, consultation. Really, the rubber needs to hit the road at some point. So I think it'd be great to see, and I think there's a question about pilot projects later. I think something to actually unlock some of the potential across these and test some of this in reality is the thing I'd be keen to start to see some movement on. It tends to be either like, we'll try this, and then if that works, we'll do something else. So I think some diverse studies and with different kinds of scope and different kinds of data needs would really sort of test what's working and what's not, which helps you sort of refine and improve as you keep going, rather than finessing the concept without actually getting into the action of delivery.
Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. And you have just segued perfectly into the next question that we've got from Thorsten Forster. So many programs build up from use cases. Is the European Health Data Space working on a selection of EU-wide health data use cases to inform infrastructure? So Claire, I know you just said about sort of prioritization of how AI can be used for drug discovery. Do any of the other speakers have thoughts on how there is an EU-wide health data use case that is happening? Quite a specific question. John?
Yeah, well, I don't repeat myself too much, but in terms of infrastructure from from like sort of a vendor perspective and thinking about well SPR as also another idea. I think there is an inherent difficulty associated with what I call architecture in the middle, which is the data standard sits there, and we're expecting suppliers and systems to interact with it, and then for it to be consumed. But not all system vendors or data storage happens in the same way. So I think in terms of those use cases, thinking about practically about how those prioritized data sets can be implemented, I think is quite important there. And they of course are use case oriented. Discharges, the clinical workflow, for example, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I would frame that answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Anyone else want to come in on use cases, or should we move over to the next attendee question? Cool. Let's jump over to the next one. So this might be staying with yourself, John, recognising your role across the devolved nations, and also Petra, I know that you're board chair for the Digital Health and Care Innovation Centre too. So Karen Mooney has shared that my understanding is that there is currently no single shared way of defining federated data. Will this be a problem in any attempt to align with the EU? Also, we need to focus on ensuring the various. Do we need to focus on ensuring the various systems within the four nations can properly communicate with each other?
It's all a problem. It's all a very well-known problem. It's a problem that won't go away. In my previous role as Assistant Chief Architect for NHS Wales, we had this cross-border issue with patients, getting treatment, who might live in Brecon going over to Shrewsbury or wherever it happened to be. Interoperability, if I wanted to be slightly ranty, I'd say interoperability's failed. When technically, of course, that's not the case. But the agreement on data standards is that it clogs up the system, essentially. So, I think, as I said, this is painting the target. It's saying, right, we want to exchange data in that kind of way. The exchange format that comes out of this will actually be an implementable API. So that's good, and that's movement. And I think one of the biggest values associated with the HDS is how it's going to be learned about going forward. The implementation of the exchange format is going to have a lot of rich learning, because certainly in my experience, the cross-border kind of problem has not gone away, and so we can't really send patient data meaningfully in a computational way from Wales to England to Scotland to Northern Ireland. So the learning, I think, is going to be important, but I think that's a positive. I think the conditions are now right for interoperability to actually start to be really, really effective, because of the convergence of the standards that is happening. So on my standard slide with HL7 and so on and so forth. Okay, HL7 and OpenAir are collaborating. We've got there's agreements with with SNOMED, so on and so forth. These standards are really starting to converge, or the organizations behind these standards are starting to converge, because there's now a growing maturity to the discussion about how to solve interoperable problems. And that actually, when you use multiple standards, they become more than the sum of their parts. So slightly long-winded way of saying, yes, it's always been a problem and it maintains to be a problem. But actually, I think now we are moving really productively into a new way of solving these challenges. And the HDS is one of those vehicles.
Mm. Brilliant. Well, it's great to see that the HDS is an opportunity, hopefully, for us to tackle that challenge between the nations. Petra.
I just want to build on that a little bit. Interoperability has been a problem for as long as I've worked in this field. I think the problem is changing slightly, because the way in which people are using AI to address some of the challenges associated with interoperability are making or are perhaps diminishing the problem a little bit. But I think the other thing that is really important, as John has just said, the EHDS itself will generate really good learnings on how we address interoperability, because it is a problem across the 27 nations of the EU, the nations of the EEA, and everybody's got slightly different ways of tackling it. Germany, for example, has just announced a whole new raft of laws and has come at it with a very top-down legal approach. Other countries, France, for example, has come up with a very sort of collaborative, co-creative approach with some of the big vendors in the field. And I think our advantage is that we can do things a little bit in a magpie fashion. We can look at what all these other countries are doing and see what works, because we don't have to have the same time pressure as they have. So I think it really gives a lot of opportunity for us to look and learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Tim or Claire, would you like to come in that one? If not, I'll move over to our next question. No? Okay, perfect. So Petra, you've actually shaped a brilliant segue for me to move into learning from other EU, not other because we're not in, but EU countries. So Natalie Hunter has said, in the UK, we see resistance to data sharing from privacy lobby groups and some corners of healthcare professions. And then her question is this also true in the EU? How do or have the Commission handled it, and have member states handled it as well? Any examples on that one? So are you aware of how EU member states or the EU Commission have handled issues around privacy lobby groups and some corners of healthcare professions resisting to data sharing? Tim?
Well, I mean, the example of engagement that has been done, of course, is TEDS 1, where UPD was involved in this 3-country-wide investigation. But, you know, everything I've been involved in feels like, you know, they haven't done enough yet, and it hasn't really, you know, is it going to be a problem or not? However, starting from a point of secure data environments, you know, there's another thing in the chat about anonymized data. You know, this isn't anonymized data, it's de-identified data, which doesn't move. And all of the engagements I've been historically involved in is if you tell people their data is not going anywhere, they're much more comfortable. A lot of the worries have been industry's going to get a whole copy of my data and then do things to it that I don't want, that I don't know about. And if you have a regulated environment where you have to do what you're monitored and you can't take the data away, then people feel generally much more comfortable. So I think it's starting from a better position than our historical positions with anonymized data distribution in the UK.
Great, thank you, Tim. And hopefully we can achieve that moving forward as well. John?
Yeah, I'd say what's interesting is that it's about being explicit about the rights and protections up front, because EHDS is describing that data, it's the patient's data, and it's supporting their ability to get treated when they go cross-border, which is very important here. It's also, you know, in principle, it's read-only. It's a view. Although, you know, if we actually crack the nut about being able to structure the data correctly, it becomes far more powerful. And that's certainly something that I'm working on with colleagues as part of the National Shared Care Record in Ireland. There's the potential of it becoming bi-directional in future, but that's much, much further off. But, you know, because we are talking about things from a patient's rights perspective, then it's including the rights about who can access data and making sure that that access is auditable, and the safeguards that are placed then around secondary use and so on and so forth. But it's not looking, even this opt-in, opt-out kind of thing, kind of like a approach. Really, the whole thing about care.data, for example. I really understand that the patients care about how their data is being used, but principally all of that is secondary, because this is about making sure that you can be cared for if you fall ill when you aren't in your home country, which is about primary care, isn't it, really?
Great, thank you very much, John. And Claire?
As Tim said, I think there's a lot of benefit of learning from previous mistakes or experiences that we've seen across the system. I also think broadly in the development of the scope of these documents in the run-up, there's been a lot of consideration of different ethical positions across different countries and different patient and public views around how data should be used or not used. They've taken a long time actually thinking about how to best align some of that. Which is obviously absolutely critical, not least because of, again, John sort of focused on the direct care benefits, thinking in about secondary use for research and other use cases. They are they end up in being quite distinct conversations. And again, I will come back to quoting Andrew again, is today's research is tomorrow's care. And so if we want to ensure that we have the best possible care for patients in the future, how we don't lose sight of the ability to use that data for research to ensure that we can get that through. And then so not losing sight and keeping sure that we keep those sufficiently coupled, even if we have to do the work to explain what those different benefits are and where some of them will be more immediate and some of those are going to be over the longer term and may not directly benefit those individuals, but will certainly benefit the ecosystem overall.
Great, thank you, Claire. So sort of having those real world benefits up front and that trust there is key in moving forward. I can see that this one is creating like quite a lot of conversation. I'll come to Petra and then John and Tim, please do jump in once more.
I'm going to go to the piece on what is the EU doing about this, what's the Commission doing about it, and to quote a previous UK Prime Minister, the EU's approach to this is education, education, education. They're investing a lot of money in building tools and supporting member states in building the tools that can provide educational materials, advocacy materials to build trust in use of health data, both amongst the data subjects, so patients and citizens, and amongst the people who may use that data for secondary secondary use purposes. And I think one of the important tools that they really need to get right is the reporting at the end of each year on how data has been used and what good has come out of it. So that's secondary use. But if we can get that right, if they can get that right, and if in due course we get it right, and we can really reinforce the idea to citizens that citizens benefit from data about them being used, we can really build trust in it being used and ideally get people to donate data that may not necessarily be held by their healthcare systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Petra. So really pushing home the message of sort of real world data examples and sort of benefit use cases. John.
Yeah, the one thing I should have mentioned about certainly the for direct care kind of element there is actually the keys are completely held by the patient in that scenario as well. You know, they give the permission. They will, you know, in theory, show a QR code on their app. In fact, the one thing I didn't put in my slides was stick a QR code, but I was slightly worried I'd put a QR code that went somewhere and somebody would actually scan it, so I didn't include it. But that explicit or implicit permission slip that's given, you know, really says you've got control over how your data is going to be used, and somebody's asking if it's okay for that care. Now, I know that is made more complicated when we start considering secondary use and things like that, but you know, it's important to realize, I think, that you know there has been a lot of thought put into how this access should be granted and so on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John and Tim.
Yeah, so since Palantir was mentioned in that question, which seems to have vanished, I just want to mention that, you know, look at what's happening in Europe very strongly now around digital sovereignty. It's a real issue of American tech. And I talked about the data spaces. The Commission is sponsoring Simple as a sort of open source API for handling across those. You have, in the last few days, you have France moving entirely to Linux for all government systems, so millions and millions of people. Germany has been piloting that. I mean, more than piloting, an entire region of Germany is doing the same thing, and they're writing about all the things you have to implement. So that's a real theme right now in Europe. And of course, EHR systems, Germany has a lot of open EHR implementations. There's, you know, real capacity to build off open platforms and use that as underpinning. And part of the worries, you know, we see the news reports about American tech and data, and because of the strength, you know, we're following GDPR, but you know, the Europeans are following it more strongly and considering these points of view. and that's leading to these migrations. And in many ways, that's an opportunity because if you all sponsor open source, that becomes a vehicle for the world. And I talked about interoperability and federation across much wider than just Europe. You see countries around the world now associated with Europe. Canada's associated with S3, which is the underpinning of research infrastructures for Europe. So there are quite a lot of interesting developments around building openness rather than expensive proprietary tools in the European space right now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. And sort of a theme that kept popping up in your answers to that one as well was trust, transparency, communication, all those key ideas that sort of really lend to what UPD is trying to do here around sort of patient trust and encouraging that better use of health data through public confidence in the uses. So we are going to move into a poll now to bring us to the end of our session. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us for the Q&A and sharing such insightful and thorough answers to the questions that attendees have presented. So if you could please, yes, perfect. Thank you, Nadia. And the next slide as well, please. So you've got the same two questions that we kicked the session off with. And it'd be great to get an idea of how much you feel you know about the European health data space right now. So after we've heard from our brilliant guest speakers, how confident are you feeling around the European health data space? So you've got moderate amount is taking the lead, which is good because I think we started either not at all or a little when we kicked things off earlier. So it's great to see that one jumping up. Give it a little bit longer whilst the bars are still moving about a bit. Okay. Oh, no, we're still going. Okay, so we've got about 50% sitting at a moderate amount, which is great to see that jump from the initial poll at the start. And moving on to the next one, please, Nadia. Thank you very much. So final question for today's session. What importance or relevance do you think the European health data space holds for the UK? This was sitting at very important for the most part as well at the start of the session. So hopefully with a little bit of a nudge, those we might see a little bit more importance around there. Try not to sway any answers. I'm very bad at that. Brilliant. So all of our speakers have spoken to this, the different sort of implications for the UK coming off the back of the European health data space. So hopefully you've got a good idea of what is going on, key challenges, key benefits that we'll be seeing over here. Okay, brilliant. That started to settle down. So I'm going to hand back over to Anna to bring us to a close today. Thank you, Anna.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have so many people attend, and obviously we're incredibly grateful to all of the amazing speakers. You really brought the topic to life. If you're wanting to learn more, we've talked about TEDAS, which is the collaboration of sort of 30 European countries who are developing the practical guidance for how EHDS is actually going to work. They have got a forum running that's online or in person if you can get a last-minute flight, I think also over in Cyprus. But they are, running an event next week, and also they'll have a live public consultation over May or June, which we'd obviously really encourage people to contribute to if they are interested, and we'll also keep you up to date with future events of ours. The next event that we're going to be running in this series in a few weeks' time, if you go to the next slide please, sorry, is to hear more from other countries. For example, from Australia, thinking about how they've overcome cultural barriers to data collection through meaningful engagement with Aboriginal communities, how Norway's turning their sort of data management from a challenge into the backbone of success, and how Canada's taking on that challenge of responding to public concern around trust, governance and the influence of American big tech. And we'll also have a keynote from the Chief Medical Information Officer for Portugal, who is Dr. Henrique Martins as well. So hopefully you'll join us again for that. And in the meantime, we wish you a very happy, hopefully sunny Thursday. And any questions, obviously, please get in touch. Thank you.